Donc, il est président de l'Institut international de l'économie de la pêche, mais aussi il est membre du comité scientifique du programme PPR, programme pluridisciplinaire, prioritaire recherche, océan et climat. Voilà. Olivier, tu as 20 minutes pour faire une très belle présentation.
Merci Christophe. Et bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais essayer de ne pas me faire prendre. I'll shift to English right now. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to give a talk today. I'm going to take you offshore a bit further out and also at the same time closer to people and society, hopefully, and try and run you through some of the work that we've been doing, trying to combine our understanding of ecological processes out in the ocean and the dynamics of uses in the interaction between those. I'll be using fisheries examples to try and get the messages across that I'd like to get. And I'll be relying on work that's been done by myself with colleagues. I'll take you into the Bay of Biscay for a bit, but we'll come back to French Guiana, and some colleagues and friends are actually in this room today. Abdul Cissé, Bassirou Diop, Fabien Blanchard can't be here today, but these people have also contributed to this work. And so here we go. And one thing that I'd like to start by is to say that I still feel sometimes we perceive our role as scientists as if natural resource management was an exercise in what I've called remote control. So we've got your policymaker with a remote pushing buttons of policy actions, right? And the scientist is providing an image of how the world might change depending on which button is being pushed by the policymaker. And then hopefully we're helping in the process for decisions to be made that will help get the right image on that screen, right? And reality is that those buttons, that remote, is a complex social, economic, political system with a triggering of cascading interactions between the different types and levels of responses in society. And the actual impact of whatever policy decision is being decided or made is going to depend on the chain of interactions that happens in society, right? And the feedbacks will be important as well. And the kinds of policy decisions that might be doable or feasible, the actual buttons on that remote will depend on the structure of these societal processes. So what you want really is to understand these things. Why? Well, because we see every day that it's not because we know and understand the problems at stake that action is being triggered, right? We're aware of a number of problems and we feel nothing's being done adequately to address them. And the other thing is we want to go to places, we want to have a better world. And the real question I find is how do we get there and what the transitions are that we want to work through. And to do that, you have to understand the societal aspects of those decisions. Okay, so why then model and why use simulations and mathematical models to inform this process? Well, because ideally you'd want to be able to connect our understanding of the ecological processes and our understanding of the social and economic processes in a nice integrated picture such as this one. This is courtesy of my colleague Beth Fulton from CSIRO in Australia, and Beth describes what management strategy evaluation for managing a natural resource could look like, or should look like maybe, in principle. And she says we want a description of the dynamics of the ecosystem. We want to understand the dynamics of the users and the interactions between these two components of our social ecological systems. We also want to represent our understanding of how we measure, and we actually want to potentially model how we understand these processes directly and indirectly, include that in modeling frameworks, and then in decision processes that lead to identify the trade-offs given the objectives we have for the management of these resource systems. And my perception still today, it's changed, but I had that feeling when I became an economist specialized in natural resource management questions, is that quite often this is what you get in reality. So we do have a lot of information and we can always get more. We heard how we don't know about sediment in mangroves and how we don't know about the dynamics of waves and how that will evolve in the long run. But still, there is information around. And very often when you try and say, okay, let's couple that information and understanding with what we know of the social and economic systems, well, we do have bits of information, but quite often it's highly partial. In terms of empirical data, quantitative information, as well as qualitative understanding. And the extent to which we then use these models in stakeholder engagement and coordinated interactions with people is also quite limited. So basically your flight simulator that you'd like to use as we talk these days about digital twins that we will use to test out scenarios and possible futures. Well, that flight simulator actually is showing you part of what you want to see, right? You want to have more than that. And it's a bit like if you were looking at a system, or think of a bus. Sorry, I'll just go back to this one. There's a bus, for the fans of Keanu Reeves, think of the Speed movie, with this bus coming down the roads like mad, and you're wondering what's going to happen with that bus. You could analyze the mechanics of the bus. Think about the wheels, how they might turn, think about the inertia. That's all going to be highly important, but you also want to worry about the driver or the guys fighting in that bus to decide where the bus is actually going to head, right? So think about that as a metaphor of what I'm trying to convey here as the importance of including these social and economic drivers. And so what you want to do is understand the users. It's off. Yeah, it's off. Understand. Yeah. It's gone. This one's gone. I'll try this one. Understand. Yep, it's working. The users of marine ecosystem, what drives them, and their responses to change, and that's going to involve economics. It's also going to involve social psychology, potentially, the understanding of values and norms. You really want to get a sense of how these activities that interact with our ecosystems respond and evolve. And you also want to develop our evaluation frameworks, fully including values, social values that people hold for these systems. And you want to then transfer that or translate it into evaluation metrics that can be used to assess the extent to which we're meeting the objectives that we might have collectively to manage these systems. And you want to then find ways of assessing and communicating trade-offs, and that's got to be working across ecological, economic, and social dimensions, which is what we've heard we want to do throughout the presentations of the programs that we have in the room today, the PEPR. So fisheries. Fisheries is a great example to illustrate these problems. It's got a very strong conceptual foundation in terms of understanding the interaction between biomass dynamics, population dynamics, and harvesting, and the economics of that harvesting. The nice thing about fisheries is also that if you change things in the policy, you might see the responses within a time frame that is the time frame of a political representative, a few years. It might even be less before you see the success of a policy aimed to manage your fishery. And what you typically have in a bioeconomic model is a description of a stock biomass and some dynamic response to the status of that biomass and environment. You'll get fishing effort leading to fishing mortality, which will impact that biomass. That will also generate your catches, part of which will be landed and sold, and that's your revenue. The fishing activity generates costs. The difference between your revenue and your costs will determine the economic profitability of this activity, and that will have in turn consequences on the dynamics of your fleets, what they fish for, where they go, and whether there's more fishing boats the next year or less fishing boats, right? So you've got a dynamic system here, social and economic, and a dynamic biological system. And so I'll take you to the Bay of Biscay to show you what we have used that model for in sort of fairly applied approaches over time, increasingly applied towards informing management. We developed this model of the nephrops fishery, La Langoustine, which is a high value stock. And what we do is you use the existing information to calibrate biological and economic compartments for that model and look at the historical record for the fishery. So we get an estimated biomass in early 90s or mid 90s, and then what the status is in the 2000s. And you look at the fleet size, you can look at your profits levels per vessel, and your catches and landings. Okay, so you're basically able to reproduce the actual observations. This is very analytical, so highly stylized at this stage, and I'll show you how we've expanded on that. Stylized means we can find analytical solutions to what the outcomes might be of different management options for that system. And then what we introduced, taking into account this multi-objective aspect of evaluating the outcomes of management, is what we called viability constraints. And by that, we mean we want to maintain our system within acceptable limits for the biology of the target species, here, nephrops. We didn't want the stock to go below an estimated reference level, okay? For the economic performance of the fleet, well, we wanted to maintain a certain level of economic performance for our vessels. And then for the social dimensions, we used a proxy, which was that we wanted to maintain a minimum level of active vessels in that fishery, because with a minimum level of boats, you get landings, you get people on the docks working, so you get the fishing community active and maintained. Okay, another aspect of that was maintaining stability. People are unhappy when you get big variations in the possible activity for a fishing fleet, so you want to maintain stability there. And using this, what you can do is say, well, here's a set of states for our fishery, from which, so in terms of the stock biomass and the fleet size, given the dynamics that we've included behind this description of the fishery, there's a set of states in white here, from which there's at least one sequence of decisions, of combinations of fishing effort, which will maintain your system forever, in this very simplified representation, within the viability constraints. And we call this the viability kernel. And then we look at the historical trajectory and we see, oh, but it's there in the more recent years, but there's been a time when it was outside that space. And when it's outside that space, it means that in finite time, one at least of the viability constraints will be infringed. We will not have a viable fishery. And I don't know if you've got a bit of water here somewhere, but if anybody's got a bit of water, I'll buy it for a high price. So 1994, according to this analysis, was not viable. Thanks a lot, Gwen. And so once you realize this, then you think, okay, so what happened in 1994? Okay, well, you could use the model to say, let's look at alternative options to restore a viable fishery. And one option is to close it down for a certain amount of time, however long it takes for the biomass to recover to a level where you can reauthorize a level of fishing that will maintain you in that viable fishing space. Okay, so you could do that. We calculated that from that initial point, it would have taken a year. Okay, so from that point, you close the fishery down for a full year, it'll be restored to the viable space. That's an option. Closing the nephrops fishery in Brittany for a full year? Yeah, no, it's not an option. Politically too difficult, too sensitive. So you have to find accommodations around that opportunity. And what you do is look at maintaining lower levels of fishing activity that will maintain transitional performance, economic performance for your vessels. And what that does mechanically is it increases the time to restore a viable fishery. So rather than being 1 year, if you maintained an ability, for the vessels to fish and generate profits transitionally, then what you get is something closer to 4 or 5 years for a given level of transition profit that you want to maintain. So basically there's this trade-off between the speed at which you try and recover a viable state for your system and the social here implications and political implications. If you account for these and have a slower approach to recovery, then it will take longer. And potentially it could be infinite time if your requirements on the transition are too demanding, basically. Okay, so we do this with a very simple model, but of course the reality is much more complex. So this is what the Bay of Biscay fishery that targets nephrops also targets. These vessels here, the nephrops trawler, they catch a lot of nephrops. These were the guys we were working on. But they also interact with other species that they catch, which are being caught by some other fleets. So our system, our social and economic system, is way more complex than our simplified model was representing. And we developed adapted versions of this model that fully capture that complexity. So we have individual fleets with their interactions with the different species. Here, 3 are represented, but we've got models now capturing 25 to 30 species, different species, including some that might have very low economic value and others that have high economic value. And then what we do is we consider setting viability constraints to maintain certain aspects of this system, the diversity of the fishing fleets, the diversity of the fish community, as well as some economic performance metrics. I won't go into the detail of that because I want to take you back here to French Guiana, but this is to give you a sense of what we can do with some reasonable quality of data available to look not only at the biological dynamics, but also at the social and economic aspects. Now, coming back to French Guiana, we did do some bioeconomic modeling back in the years 2005-10. We had a project called Chaloupe with Fabien Blanchard. And as part of that, we developed a bioeconomic model with the help of a colleague, Christian Chabou from IRD, looking at the shrimp fishery. And then more recently with Fabien, we said, well, let's look at that model, what we'd predicted at the time, and try and figure out what actually happens and try and learn from that. And that was another useful way we felt of using these bioeconomic models, because they're always tended to use, that we tend to use them in projections when it's actually quite nice to also look back sometimes at what we tried to predict. That was the history where we started from. Numbers of vessels, originally US and Japanese vessels, and then France decided this was going to be a French-only fishery, up to 70 vessels harvesting shrimp in the mid-90s, and then it was on the sort of going down, but still quite a number of vessels. And we had between 3,000 and 4,500 tons of shrimp landed in French Guiana back in the 90s. And so what we do is same thing. We develop a model that incorporates the dynamics of our resource, as well as the dynamics of the fleet. I won't go into the details of this. This is our time machine, right? This is what we use to travel in the future at the time. And that's what we're using now to try and look backwards and think about what did we get right and what did we get wrong. We calibrated this model against available data. So we were trying to predict how the number of active fishing vessels would change with economic drivers, such as costs of fuel, shrimp prices that were going down due to competition of aquaculture shrimp on the global market, as well as biological parameters. And you can see we had something we felt we could work with in terms of predicting, because we were actually able to replicate the recent history. Monthly accumulated catches, and then there's this estimated biomass, and the simulated biomass were fairly close as well. And then we projected scenarios, rather pessimistic scenarios from an economic perspective, because of this competition on the market for shrimp, for smaller shrimp that were being landed due to aquaculture, but also because we felt at the time that the subsidy that is being paid to producers to help bring the shrimp to the European market was likely to be reduced because of the political context at the time around subsidies for fisheries. So we thought, it could be strongly reduced or maybe just not that strongly reduced. So this was very pessimistic and this was pessimistic. Scenario 2 was just pessimistic. But also fuel prices we expected would be on the increase. And we thought that was going to drive the development of the fishery. And so these are the scenarios we projected. So A and B is scenario 1, the very pessimistic. And then so B is your number of vessels going down because it's not profitable as much as it had been to harvest. And that leads to a predicted increase in stock biomass. And of course, with a less stringent degradation in the conditions and the economic conditions of the activity, well, you get something that's a bit less marked. And then you look at what happened. And so if you focus here on this bottom chart here, green is your tons landed over the simulation period. We had predicted a sort of stabilization. It actually continued to decrease, and the Aris fishing. Fuel prices did increase quite dramatically, so that clearly had led to degradation in the economic conditions of the fishing activity. What we got wrong was our predictions in shrimp prices. We were expecting competition on the global market to drive the prices down. The prices actually rebounded after the end of the financial crisis because of the real big increase in the international demand for shrimp. So that was actually something that maintained fishing activity somewhat to higher levels than we would have predicted with our low price anticipations. But the most important thing here was the sort of drop in stock biomass that led to think there would be environmental drivers at play here. And colleagues in the room, Bassirou Diop, looked into this and the impacts of climate change in trying to explain these trends. But also the buffering role of mangroves in allowing for that impact to be dampened. Okay. The approach has been extended to small-scale fisheries, work of colleagues here, looking at all the other small-scale fisheries that are important for French Guiana. In the process, Abdul Cissé here developed this trophic network approach, so incorporating biological interactions between the different species, and applied the same viability framework to try and assess whether some scenarios would allow to maintain both the economic performance of the different fishing types in the system, as well as overall catch and the diversity in terms of species composition of the fish community. And then more recently, folks have gone on to incorporate other aspects of small-scale artisanal fisheries in French Guiana, including the illegal foreign fishing component and the impacts of environmental changes and local market conditions. So expanding on the complexity of the drivers that are being considered. Okay, I've got a few slides on what I think are some of the key challenges to take this forward. The first, I think, is data. So I'm coming back to this. I think we have seen an increase in the availability of data on human activities out in the ocean. There's more and more high resolution data available. This is really crucial. It's helping to increase the quality of the modeling work we can do that's really applied, and to connect our understanding of human activities, how they distribute in space and time, and the impacts or interactions with ecological systems. But we still have a long way to go. And I think for here, this is particularly important. And Eduardo yesterday spoke of a statistical and social invisibility problem. And I really like that, because what you can't measure, you can't see and you don't care about, or you might care about, but it's very hard to get into the picture. And I think this is very, very important. So to me, one of the key challenges is to actually get the resources and the effort to collect more empirical data on these human activities interacting with our ecosystems. A second big challenge, is dealing with system complexity. We're increasing the complexity of the ecological components that we include in these models, but we're also increasing the complexity of the social dimension. Remember, fishermen in the stock assessment models of our fish biologists were reduced to F back in the days. And now we have agents, fleets, multiple agents, potentially multi-scale systems that you want to look at in terms of social structure and coordination, as well as interactions with other users of ecosystems and potentially markets and whole of socioeconomic systems. So there's a challenge in terms of the kinds of models we can use and still get a sense of what's going on. There's also a challenge in terms of how we communicate these things. Because if these are going to be for decision support, then we've got to be careful about how we can use them to inform policy and decision, going back to my initial point. And one of the things we've tended to do with the colleagues working in this space is to adopt this MICE approach, where you select what you want to capture in a model based on a question and a capacity to quantify the key processes that you include in your model. So if you might have a nice question, but no data, well, you're not going to have a model. And then this will be my last illustration. So we've asked stakeholders what they care about when they think about mangrove systems and how they perceive mangrove ecosystem services associated with mangroves. And this is a synthesis of work that was done interviewing a whole range of stakeholders. And it starts with what I call the bus, okay? This is our understanding of some of the key processes that we heard about earlier on in the session today. And then people talk about pressures, anthropogenic pressures coming from different avenues and impacting those dynamics, okay? And then people talk about ecosystem services themselves and disservices associated to these dynamics. And I won't go into the details, but it's getting complexer, okay? And then to finish, you get the activities and the regulations. You get the interventions that happen at multiple levels in the system. And this is the picture we got out of our interviews of however many stakeholders in doing fuzzy cognitive maps. Okay, so it becomes a pretty complex picture. And the question of what is it we can focus on, this is where our fishery is, right? Fishery resources, biodiversity is caught in that network of interactions. And the question of how we work with stakeholders to identify those components that we want to focus on to develop models that will help understand what's going on and inform decisions is a really important one. Thanks for your attention. And if you want to, sorry, just a bit of advertising. Thank you. And if just a bit of advertising, we had a symposium in Brest in 2016 called the Marine Socio-Ecological Systems Conference, bringing people together interested in this stuff. We're holding another one in 24 in Japan. The call for abstracts is still open, and we'd be happy to get folks from French Guiana participate if you want to. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Merci Olivier pour cette superbe présentation. Merci d'avoir commencé par des courbes qui paraissent très simples, mais qui ont une implication socio-économique juste énorme, et de terminer par la complexité qui rejoint tout ce qu'on a dit dans les deux précédentes présentations. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Moi, j'ai beaucoup de questions là pour toi, Olivier, mais voilà, on a le temps pour une ou deux questions. Basse. Ah bah, Edouard, merci. Bast, tu as une question, hein?
Very, very nice talk, Olivier. You mentioned complexity and instability, okay? So you need to have some trade-offs between the final results you get and the factors you factor into your model. How does this affect the output you get? I mean, have you got an assessment tool to let you know whether if this factor is not factored in, does it work properly? Does it,
I mean that's been an ongoing debate in the literature on how far you can complexify your models and still get traction. Folks have developed, so in the Southern Hemisphere, CSIRO colleagues have developed this Atlantis modeling approach. And they've thought a lot about this in terms of looking at, so your classic would be sensitivity analysis. So how does including yet another parameter or another variable or another process, how does that modify your outcomes? So that's the sort of structural uncertainty, which is the biggest problem. It works up to a point, but it can become so complex that your sensitivity analysis would be, I mean, maybe we can ask ChatGPT, but otherwise, it becomes very difficult. So the alternative approach, which is this MICE approach, is to say, okay, we've got a practical question, a policy question, which we think requires understanding a selected set of variables and interactions between these variables. That's what we're going to, and we have data, or we will go and collect data that informs us on those processes. We're going to take that and we're going to focus on that. And so it's a part and a very pragmatic approach. And this is the MICE perspective.
Have you got limitations in terms of computing time?
For the ones we've used, I mean, the Bay of Biscay is probably the most complex system and this is, we're working with the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea to incorporate this approach in the regular assessment process that informs policy decisions on an annual basis. And you can run this, I mean, it's overnight, basically. So Atlantis people have had these kinds of problems of computing time. But,
Une petite question encore. Moi, j'en avais une, Olivier. Est-ce que dans les modèles socio-économiques que tu présentais, par exemple, le fonctionnement, je ne sais pas comment dire, le behavior des poissons, voire même de l'écosystème mangrove, est déjà pris en compte?
Comportement, tu veux dire en termes de distribution, par exemple,
distribution, donc au minimum, c'est les périodes de reproduction. Mais est-ce que, par exemple, la vie de telle espèce de poisson impactée par des températures d'eau qui augmentent et peut être déjà prise en compte dans des modèles tu n'as pas montré les mécanismes qu'il y a derrière chaque composante, mais...
Alors, sur le golfe de Gascogne, par exemple, il y a eu un travail d'extension de certains des modèles là, où on sait qu'il y a des corrélations entre l'élévation de la température et des défauts de recrutement sur des espèces comme la sole. Et donc, on a des papiers qui présentent des projections qui intègrent, donc qui replacent la question de la gestion de la sole en termes de possibilités de pêche annuelle dans un contexte de changement finalement de l'habitat pour la sole. Donc ça, c'est des choses qui se font. Ici, les collègues ont pris en compte l'impact de la mangrove en tenant compte de, comme il y a cette variabilité spatiale des surfaces de mangrove et qu'il y a des mesures potentiellement de productivité de la pêche à la crevette associées, il y a des travaux et des papiers de base ici qui regardent cette corrélation et voient comment l'intégrer dans l'analyse que tu peux faire des possibilités de gestion de la pêcherie. Mais là, plutôt sous l'angle du buffer que l'habitat de mangrove semble présenter sans que ce soit décortiqué en termes de mécanismes et de processus. Donc, c'est un peu boîte noire, mais ça se fait, ouais.
Bon, merci Olivier, on est obligé d'en